Every time a new Monster Hunter game is announced, one of the most discussed topics, apart from the mechanical features that can be added, is which monsters will appear on that upcoming installment. Everyone has their picks as well as the multiple reasons behind their choices. Maybe it's their favorite. The monster hasn't been present in the series for a long time. Perhaps it belongs to a spin-off game, or even maybe just a lore reference like the Gaia Dragon, for example. The monster roster in this series is extremely important for the community because they are not only emotionally invested on those monsters to a degree, but also because fans know their value on the games they are in. These bosses represent the title's progression, the kind of difficulty and the level of variety that Entrio will offer to players both aesthetically and mechanically. The creation process of these rosters is not as simple as one might think. Capcom doesn't pick them randomly, even though it almost feels like it's the case. They take many parameters into consideration during their selection. The number of biomes, the kind of biomes, the ecosystems within them, the number of Elder Dragons present, the amount of new monsters added, the new mechanics being implemented on that title, the game's theme, its narrative, the progression synergy between them, etc. The developers put a lot of thought behind its construction. But of course, that isn't to say that the end result is always flawless. Over the years, some Monster Hunter titles have been particularly criticized over some shortcomings in regards to their monster lists. Some being too small, some being too big, lack of species variety, oversaturation of a specific element, and so on. Some of these problems were due to technology limitations, which is completely understandable, but nevertheless they were issues that negatively impacted those games to variable degrees. Today though, we won't talk about that negative stuff, but rather have some fun and speculate a possible roster for the upcoming game Monster Hunter Wilds, while also trying to avoid previous flaws made in past titles since we are at it. So let's get to work. Before we begin though, let me clarify some aspects of this discussion first. To let everyone know from the get-go, I won't be naming every single monster present in this theoretical list. That would make this video vastly longer than it should be. These lists are always numbered in the dozens, so you can imagine how long it would take to describe every single one of them. Besides, this is going to be a vague and broad speculation of the kind of roster we can potentially see in Wilds, not necessarily a precise list of the monsters. However, I will mention some here and there for context reasons, but nothing definitive. There are many layers that these rosters are composed of, so let's address them one at a time. For starters, instead of picking a random number to determine its size, we will use averages as a safe bet to prevent unrealistic guesses. For this and all future estimates, we will use the data available from both mainline and portable series, excluding the spin-offs like Frontier, Explore, Stories and Online. So the games we will use in these calculations will be Monster Hunter 1, DOS, Freedom Unite, Portable 3rd, 3 Ultimate, 4 Ultimate, Generations Ultimate, Worldborn and Risebreak. Let's begin with the total amount of monsters, including Master Rank DLC of course. If we do the averages, we will get the value of 59. However, that is a significantly lower number if we compare it to all the titles released in the past decade. So instead of taking that number in a vacuum and call it a day, we must consider the circumstances of the series in general and Wilds in particular. Monster Hunter's next entry is in a unique position in relation to older titles. Unlike the majority of their previous games, including World, Rise was developed in RE Engine, which despite allowing Capcom to reintroduce many species that couldn't be implemented in World due to technical difficulties, engine transitions are always a very complex and time-consuming process, even if said engine is internally made. In Rise's case, having to deal with the pandemic on top of it resulted in having a roster considerably smaller than its predecessor, which is understandable under the circumstances at that time. Hi everyone, Editing Zeg here. So there's a small mistake on the script that can be taken out of context, so I just want to clarify that real quick. Whenever I'm referring to the monster roster, I'm actually referring to the content in general. Since Base Rise had massive issues when it comes to that, I believe it didn't even have the end of the story. But it's not the monster roster that I'm referring to, since that would be actually incorrect. Base Rise had 46 monsters, if I'm not mistaken, while World actually had only 36. So I was referring to the content in general and how troublesome the development was, not necessarily the roster specifically. So yeah, that's about it. Wilds, on the other hand, won't have that issue anymore. In fact, not only Capcom already has experience working on that engine for this IP, Wilds especially is, as far as I'm aware, potentially the Monster Hunter title with the longest development time by far. So with that in mind, the amount of content in the first 6th generation game will be very significant, perhaps even surpassing World once fully realized. But let's not go too far on that either, and rather take a safe bet and expect a roster of 70 monsters, pretty much the same as Worldborn. Alright, next. Each roster can be divided into 3 distinct categories. Dromes, which represent most monsters in the early game, Wyverns, these being most monsters of the list itself, and Elder Dragons, the main portion of the roster present in the late game. Keep in mind that these are not literal names. Not all early game monsters are dromes of some kind, the same way not all end bosses are Elder Dragons. This is just a generalization for simplicity's sake. The latter in particular is important, because not only they are an impactful part of the game's narrative, it also embodies the end gameplay loop players will have later on. So let's take an extra attention to those for a second. Assuming for a moment that all end game bosses are Elder Dragons. I know they aren't, but just imagine. Doing some math once again, we know that the average amount of actual Elder Dragons is 12. However, here's a caveat. Ever since for Ultimate up until and including Risebreak, that amount has been consistently 18, and due to Wild's scale, it is safe to assume that it will be higher than 12. So taking that into account, just to be safe, we will pick the middle ground between the two and say 15. Another relevant aspect here is the amount of new monsters introduced on each game. While old faces are always good to be seen in the newest entry, new bosses also contribute to its appeal as well as being a must to keep the franchise fresh. After all, new badass opponents to fight is something people will never get tired of, and the developers continuously struck a good balance between already existent and brand new monsters on their rosters, so we will do the same on this one. Pulling the calculator yet again, we will conclude that the average amount of new monsters being introduced is 26. This number is actually pretty fitting since most of the previous titles had between 25 to 27, so this time no alterations will be needed. When it comes to drome-like monsters, you know, the early game ones, doesn't necessarily have to have drome in the name. The average is around 8, which means that the major portion of the roster, mid-game monsters basically, is composed of 47 individuals. Okay, so far we have a roster of 70 monsters, 26 of which being completely new, 8 early game, 47 mid-game, and 15 being late game. Keep in mind that this includes Master Rank DLC. I'm not expecting this to be the minimum, nor the maximum we will see once Wilds finally comes out, but I do believe that the actual list will be pretty close to these numbers. Personally, having around 80 monsters would be absolutely perfect, but 70 is still great, especially if they add more species variety. Speaking of species, I think I'm talking in behalf of the whole community when I say that there has been a big saturation of flying wyverns for the past few games. That was extremely evident in World since 19 out of the 71 monsters in that game belong to that type, taking the biggest percentage of that pie. Not to mention that many of the Elder Dragons also heavily resembled flying wyverns in their anatomy, so that made the situation even worse. Ironically, despite Rise having a lot more variety when it comes to skeletons, it had even more flying wyverns, surpassing World by one extra monster in that category. We all love them, there's no denying there. My favorite monster is a flying wyvern as well. but it would be fair and kinda refreshing to see other, less used monster types being added more often. Leviathans is understandable being extremely rare, since they are by default an aquatic field and only Troy really dove into that one, pun intended. But things like Carapacians and Neopterans, and especially amphibians, really there's literally only 3 of them if you don't count the variants, are massively underrepresented. It would be fantastic if Wilds put more emphasis on those more obscure types. It would be a very welcoming palate cleanser, opening the opportunity to add more unorthodox game mechanics or attack moves that only make sense on insect or snail-like monsters, for example. And while we are at it, distributing them across the entire game is also something that I believe would help a lot. Pretty much every single bird wyvern we have only appear in the early game, and after that we don't see them ever again. That to me is a wasted opportunity. Frontier, despite all its ridiculousness, did that reasonably well. Torrid class is still, to this day, the only late game bird wyvern that the series ever had. And that level of species diversity at any stage of the player's progression would be a great improvement, and I'm confident Wilds can deliver on that. A huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel and the content I create. If you wanna join the ranks, you can do so for only $1 a month, the link will be in the description. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and opinions down below, join our Discord server, engage with the community, and I hope to see you all next time.